Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for taking the time to join us for this afternoon's statutory open house on the City of Kingston's new zoning bylaw and Central Kingston growth strategy. We're just going to give it a few more minutes while some more folks join us, and we'll get started with the presentation shortly. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello once again. And welcome once again to tonight's session on the new zoning bylaw and Central Kingston growth strategy. My name is Mark Nardi. I'm a communications officer with the City of Kingston, and I will be facilitating today's session. However, it will be presented by members of the city's Planning Services Department. Before we begin, we just have a few quick notes here. First and foremost, for your awareness, today's session is live streamed and will be recorded on the city's YouTube channel. Video, microphone, and chat features have also been turned off when you join. And lastly, this is a statutory meeting. We do have a few technology troubleshooting points, as sometimes technology troubles do happen. First and foremost, if you are having trouble arranging the screens, you can go to adjust view options on the top corner of your Zoom panel there. That should allow you to readjust windows if you're having a hard time seeing the presentation. You can also ask any Zoom specific tech problems in the chat, which is just available on your taskbar on the bottom there. If you are having issues with the webinar at any point in time, you have a couple options. One, we recommend rejoining using the provided link that you would have received in your email when you registered. And unfortunately, if you're still having trouble with that, you can go ahead and try calling in as well at some of the numbers provided. You would also need the webinar ID, so I recommend you make a note of that. Lastly, if you do have additional tech troubles, this session, as mentioned, will be live streamed on the city's YouTube channel. You can go to the City of Kingston channel and watch it live there. It will also be converted to a recording immediately after the session. If you do have any questions, you can also try using the raised hand feature, which you can see on the bottom there of your taskbar. Today's session is formatted as a presentation followed by a Q&A, so we do have a few different methods of asking questions. First and foremost, you can ask questions in writing by typing in the Q&A area. And you see that just on the top graphic there. Your name and the question you are asking will be visible to all participants, so please bear that in mind. But you can go ahead and click that, type in any questions you'd like to ask at any point during the presentation, and staff will address them once the presentation is complete. You can also ask a question verbally during the Q&A period after the presentation by clicking raised hand, or if you're on the phone, pressing *9 to use the raised hand feature. And your microphone will be enabled. You can ask your question, and then you will be placed on mute again after, and staff will answer your question. Currently, we have 67 individuals on the call today, and we do have a registered 120, so we recognize that this is a very well-attended session, which is very exciting. However, we also know that we are taking a specific approach to make sure that we're able to address everyone's questions and comments. So we will be addressing things in two separate phases. First and foremost, we will be doing a question period, followed after by comments. Comments, there are three different ways that you can submit comments to us. So first and foremost, you can send them into via email at newzbl@cityofkingston.ca. You can also use the raised hand feature to share comments verbally after the Q&A during the comment period. We have also introduced a third way to share comments. Again, recognizing that there could be a high volume of comments. If you have text comments that you would like to share at any point in the presentation, you can go ahead and navigate over to getinvolved.cityofkingston.ca, head to the new zoning bylaw project page, and then go to the tab that says March 30th Open House Comments. And that'll just allow you to open a window. You can type in any comments you have anonymously and submit them there, and we will be providing that to staff after the fact as well. So it will be a summary of comments received. Those will not be live, so if you do have a comment live, we recommend that you use the raise hand feature. We just do have a slide here about appeal rights. I'll leave that up here so everyone has a moment to view it. It's important to note that written submissions should be directed to, again, the new zbl@cityofkingston.ca email. Any oral submission should be made at the Statutory Public Meeting of Planning Committee on April 7th, 2022 at 6 p.m. And that would be through the clerk's office via Zoom. Lastly, on the screen here are the guidelines for participation. We'll give everyone a moment here just to read them through. These govern all of our online engagement efforts. If anyone has any concerns with the guidelines for participation at any point, feel free to share them. However, seeing nothing at this point in time, we do have 68 attendees on the call, so I will go ahead and pass things over to planning staff now. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So good evening and welcome to our statutory open house for the new zoning bylaw and Central Kingston growth strategy projects. Next slide, please. So my name is Laura Flaherty. I'm the project manager in planning services, and my primary responsibility is the city's new zoning bylaw project. With me here tonight as a co-presenter is Sukriti Agarwal, the manager of policy planning. So Sukriti is responsible for all planning policy initiatives, planning services, including the Central Kingston growth strategy. We also have a number of staff present and available to answer questions during the Q&A period. So we have Paige Agnew, the Commissioner of Community Services, Tim Park, the Director of Planning Services, Jenna Morley, the Director of Legal Services and our City Solicitor, James Barr, the Manager of Development Approvals, Andrea Gummo, the Manager of Heritage Planning, and Niall Odie, Senior Planner. Next slide, please. So first of all, thank you for taking time to attend this open house on two very important projects to the city. So we appreciate everyone who has dedicated personal or professional time to review and provide comments to us. So I think final drafts of the zoning bylaw truly reflect the public feedback that we've received to date, and they are definitely better documents because of that feedback. So this is a statutory open house for both the Central Kingston Growth Strategy and the new zoning bylaw projects. You'll hear us call the Central Kingston Growth Strategy the Ckgs. The purpose of the open house is to give you, members of the public, an opportunity to review and ask questions about the final drafts of the proposed zoning bylaw and the official plan amendments. So the final drafts of both the zoning bylaw and the OPA were posted on March 9th. So tonight we're going to show you where to find the information if you haven't already looked at it, how to walk through the various components of the final drafts of both the zoning bylaw and official plan amendment documents. I'm going to hand it over to Sukriti to quickly explain some background on the Ckgs before we get into the final drafts. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Laura, and good evening, everyone. So as Laura mentioned, my name is Sukriti Agarwal, and I'm the Manager of Policy Planning with Planning Services. So the Central Kingston growth strategy was initiated in late 2017 in response to Council's consideration of an interim control bylaw that would have had the effect of prohibiting new development or alterations to residential dwellings within the districts of Sydenham, Portsmouth, and Williamsville. The study area was later expanded to include all residentially designated areas regulated by Zoning Bylaw 8499 in Central Kingston for a more holistic approach, as shown in yellow color on this map. WSP Canada Group Limited was retained to undertake this study. The intent of the study was to define strategic areas for intensification along with the zoning framework to be included in the new zoning bylaw, along with the preparation of official plan policies. The zoning recommendations have been included in the final draft of the new zoning bylaw, and the proposed amendment to the official plan includes a new section 10G to guide appropriate development in areas that were identified for intensification through this work. Next slide, please. And I'm going to hand it over back to Laura.
Thanks, Sukriti. So for those of you who are new to this project, you may be wondering what a zoning bylaw is. So the Planning Act is the provincial legislation that allows municipalities to pass zoning bylaws and contains direction about items that can be regulated through zoning and processes that must be undertaken when passing a zoning bylaw. So under the Planning Act is the provincial policy statement, or the PPS. And it's a document that sets out the direction on matters of provincial interest related to land use planning and governs development in Ontario. So zoning bylaws are required to be consistent with the PPS. And then the official plan is often what we call the OP. So it's the city's vehicle to really implement the PPS. It establishes broader policies that direct land use changes while protecting natural and cultural heritage, managing resources, and planning for necessary infrastructure. So the current OP came into force in January of 2010, and the most recent 5-year update was, it came into effect in August of 2017. So when we're passing a new zoning bylaw, it's required to conform with the official plan. So zoning bylaws are really the most detailed tools that municipalities have to regulate individual properties. So they regulate the use of land and buildings, the size, height, and location of buildings, the frontage, depth, and area of new parcels of land, loading or parking facilities, landscaping and amenity areas. They prohibit development in hazardous, contaminated, or environmentally sensitive areas, and they can be used to establish minimum separation distances. Next slide, please. So why do we need a zoning bylaw that is new and updated? So right now we have 5 main zoning bylaws that apply across the municipality, 3 of which were passed in the 1970s and 2 of them were passed in the 1990s. So in some instances, our zoning bylaws are upwards of 45 years old. The existing zoning bylaws obviously predate our current official plan, which was passed in 2010. So this means that many of the existing zoning bylaws do not reflect the current OP policies. And at present, there's a disconnect between that vision that's established by the OP and the regulations of our existing zoning bylaws. So they're really a patchwork of outdated standards with different standards that are applied depending on what area of the city a property is located in. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the new zoning bylaw project is to implement the official plan's policies with a vision to harmonize, simplify, and modernize the zoning framework across the municipality. So harmonizing is more than just a consolidation exercise of the existing zoning bylaws. Is really updating the standards in the new zoning bylaw to better align with the vision that's established by the official plan. Simplifying the zoning bylaw means that the language in the maps have been modified to be as user-friendly as possible. So obviously it is a legal document. We can't avoid all of the legal language, but we have really tried to ensure that the zoning bylaw is as user-friendly and as clean as possible. Modernizing the zoning bylaw means that we've updated the terms. We've really ensured that the uses better reflect current trends and have been written in a way that will allow for innovation and new uses to thrive in the future. Next slide, please. So let's get into the final drafts of the zoning bylaw. All of the documents are on the city's project website. So if you go to cityofkingston.ca/new zoning bylaw, once there, if you click on, I've used my pen tool in pink to try to highlight some of these steps for you. So if you click on the latest updates where I've circled in pink, the top of that latest updates page will have a status update from March of 2022. And then if you could go to the next slide, please. This is what you see underneath that status update. So you'll see various links to download the final draft documents. So fundamentally, the zoning bylaw itself is made up of 2 main components. We have the text and the maps. So on the website, you'll see that the text documents are the top 5 links where I've marked text in pink on the screen. I'll also, I'll get into the various parts of the text later in this presentation. Under that, there are 2 different ways to view the maps. So we have the static PDF-based map that will formally be included in the final version of the zoning bylaw for council's consideration. So those are the 4 links that are under the text where I've marked PDF maps in pink. We also have a more user-friendly version of maps that we'll walk through later in this presentation. The interactive map viewer, it can be accessed through the blue link where I've identified interactive maps on the screen. And then finally, we have the proposed official plan amendment that can be accessed through the link I've marked with OPA in pink on the screen. So this includes the changes to the text of the official plan, as well as the mapping changes that we're proposing. So we'll highlight those changes towards the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. So when I look at a zoning bylaw, the first place I always start is with the maps. If you click on the interactive map link I highlighted on the last slide, it'll take you to the mapping platform that was created specifically for this project. So the final draft of the new Kingston zoning bylaw has 10 different maps, and they all have different roles corresponding with different sections of the zoning bylaw. So as we go through section by section of the text document in a few minutes, I will highlight how these sections actually connect to the schedule that you see on the screen in front of you. Next slide, please. The interactive map has a number of features and different layers that need to be turned on and off to ensure you're reviewing all of the mapped information. So the 45-year-old zoning bylaws that we currently have are really one static map that tries to pack a lot of information into it. So the way that it's been broken out into the new zoning bylaw is in these 10 separate schedules, and they really have important information across all of the schedules. So when you're looking at the interactive map, at the top left of the window where I've marked the word search in pink, it'll allow you to search for any address in the city. If you don't have a specific address in mind, you can navigate to any location in the city using the zoom feature in the bottom right-hand corner that I've identified in pink. You can also use the scroll wheel on your mouse and drag and click with your mouse to change the location in that map. The 10 map schedules are all shown in the layer visibility window along the right-hand side of the screen. So schedule 1, the zoning map, is the default schedule that's visible in the viewer. It's important that I show you that the various schedules can be turned on and off to ensure that you can actually navigate through the various schedules. So where I've identified in pink the turn layers on and off, it's showing you the little eye icon beside the schedule 1 zoning map. That eye icon will allow you to actually turn the layers on and off and take a look at all of the various information on those schedules. Next slide, please. So now that I've highlighted some of the main functions of the interactive mapping, let's start at the beginning. So once you've zoomed into an appropriate area of the city on Schedule 1, the zoning map, you'll see that there are different colors that align with different zone categories. So on the front, you'll see a yellow color that aligns with the residential zones, a light green color that aligns with the open space zones, a purpley pink kind of color that aligns with the institutional zones. If you were to zoom into different areas of the city, you might see blue for employment zones, or red for commercial zones, brown for rural zones, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll also see that there are gray lines that are separating the different zones from each other. So within that yellow residential category, there are zones that are delineated within that area. In the circle on your screen that says zone code, it shows you how the mapping identifies the zones that apply to the properties. So it's white text right on top of that yellow base to show you all of the area that's within that gray outline is within the UR5 zone. So if you were to click on any part of this map, it would show a pop-up window identifying the zone code wherever you've clicked. One final thing to highlight on the zoning map, there are properties that have older exceptions that predate our official plan, and they've actually been identified as not subject to this bylaw. So there is an area on this map that's grayed out that says not subject to the zoning bylaw. So the whole point is to exclude those properties from the new zoning bylaw project altogether, and to allow the existing zoning bylaws to apply, which ensures that those existing exceptions, the permissions or the restrictions that are identified in those exceptions, will continue to apply. So over time, we'll be reviewing these older exceptions and bringing forward amendments to the new zoning bylaw where it's appropriate. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to walk through every schedule in this presentation, but I do want to remind you all to ensure that you look at every schedule when you're reviewing the maps. There is important information that's connected to various sections of the text. So the schedule that's shown on the screen right now is Schedule E, the exception overlay. It identifies all of the existing site or area-wide exceptions that have been incorporated into the new zoning bylaw. So those are the exceptions that would conform with our official plan. So to get to this schedule, you need to turn off Schedule 1, the zoning map, and turn on Schedule E, the exception overlay, using that eye icon in the layer visibility window. And then once here, you'll be able to see the two different categories of exceptions. So they're green are the legacy exceptions, and the blue are the new exceptions that have been created in the new zoning bylaw. And I'll explain the differences later in this presentation when I talk about those sections. But I did want to flag that on this specific screen, if you click on any one of those exceptions, a pop-up window will come up and it'll actually show you the applicable exception number and then the text of that exception. And you're able to expand that window or leave it at the size that it comes up at. Next slide, please. So we're going to jump into the text document. So from the project website, you'll recall that there are 5 different PDF documents with the text of the final draft. So those 5 PDFs correspond with the various parts that you see on the screen in front of you. So part 1 is, it's the majority of the standard sections from 1 to 19. We'll walk through each one of those sections shortly. Part 2 includes section 20, which are the legacy exceptions. And in the last slide that I had just showed you with the green legacy exceptions. Part 3 includes section 21, which are the blue exceptions. Again, on that last slide, the blue exceptions. Part 4 includes section 22, which are the holding conditions. And then Part 5 includes sections 23 and 24, the temporary zone, and the list of amendments to the zoning bylaw. So the reason that the final draft has been separated into 5 parts is to recognize that there are certain sections that get amended more frequently than the remaining sections. So through the site-specific rezoning process, sections 21, the exceptions, 22, the holding conditions, and 23 and 24, the list of amendments to this bylaw are frequently amended. A couple of helpful notes to assist you with using the PDF documents. The text has been formatted with bookmarks. So bookmarks basically function as a live table of contents that's functional at all points when you're scrolling through the document. So if you're using your whatever PDF viewer that you're using to review the text, if you enable the bookmarks bar, it will display a list of every section and subsection on the zoning bylaw. And then clicking any one of those bookmarks will automatically move you to that part of the document. And then finally, you can also search for specific words in the document using the find function in your PDF viewer. So on a Windows computer, the shortcut's Control F, and on a Mac, it's Command F. So these are pretty much the 2 tools that I most frequently use when I'm navigating through the text. So I just wanted to highlight those pieces for you. Next slide, please. So section 1, the administration section of the zoning bylaw. So the administration section is really establishing a legal framework for how the new zoning bylaw is to be administered. It identifies all of the sections and the schedules that actually make up the zoning bylaw, the lands that are subject to the bylaw. It talks about how the existing bylaws will be repealed. It talks about the transition of current active applications for planning application or building permit applications. It speaks to permission specifically related to legal non-conforming uses and legal non-complying buildings. It identifies the Director of Planning Services as the administrator of the zoning bylaw. It also identifies the penalties in the enforcement section for people who do not conform with the requirements of the zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So section 2, the interpretation of this bylaw, really establishes the rules for how the zoning bylaw is intended to be interpreted. So it talks about the intent of the language and the system of division of the zoning bylaw. It breaks it down into what the structure is, the parts of the zoning bylaw that legally form part of the zoning bylaw versus those that are provided for reference purposes only. It also creates the framework for categorizing the different areas of the city into zones, as I had shown you on the maps earlier. It also establishes the hierarchy of the provisions and really clearly explains that all requirements of the zoning bylaw must be complied with. It has rules for interpreting map boundaries and how to interpret any kind of mapped information. Next slide, please. So the definitions are in section 3. So throughout the whole zoning bylaw, the language is really intended to align with the common ordinary meaning in the dictionary. There are, however, certain words and terms that have a very specific meaning that's required to properly interpret the intent of the provisions of the zoning bylaw. So within this definition section, you'll see it's categorized from A to Z. It's all in alphabetical order, and where a term is defined in this section 3 throughout the entire text of the zoning bylaw, you'll see that it's bolded in a gray bold font to highlight for you that this is a defined term, and you should go back and refer to section 3 to really be able to understand the intent of that section relative to the defined term. So almost all of the requirements that are explained in the zoning bylaw, they are connected to a defined term, and they're very much drafted with intention and understanding the context of how that word is used throughout the entire zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. So section 4 contains the general provisions. General provisions are basically the requirements that are the same across the entire city or across common areas or zones. So obviously this section is one of the longest sections in the entire zoning bylaw. It creates a lot of common requirements for items such as accessory buildings, swimming pools, amenity areas, site triangles, generally permitted or prohibited uses. Schedule 4, the road classification map, is connected to the site triangle provisions in subsection 4.6, and that specifically identifies arterial, collector, or local roads. So the site triangle provisions are connected to the road type as per that map. The general provisions also include, there are planting strip requirements for non-residential uses. There are minimum distance separation requirements between livestock facilities and non-agricultural uses. There are railway separation distances and water body separation distances. So the general provisions really establish the rules wherever these are located across the city. Next slide, please. So section 5 are the overlay provisions. So the overlay provisions are a series of requirements that have provisions that are specifically connected to a series of maps. So schedules A, B, C, D, E, and F that I had showed you earlier, they're specifically tied to the overlay provisions in this section. So it's really intended to protect from natural and human-made hazards, identify constraint areas, map out the site-specific exceptions, both the legacy exceptions and those new blue exceptions, and establish conditions connected to known or potential constraints that must be satisfied before development can occur. So we have the floodplain overlay, which corresponds with Schedule A. We have the source water protection overlay, which corresponds with Schedule B. We have the airport noise exposure overlay, which corresponds with Section C. The additional residential unit overlay, which corresponds with Schedule D. The exception overlay, which corresponds with Schedule E, which I had identified earlier today. And then the holding overlay, which corresponds with Schedule F. Next slide, please. So the specific use provisions, they basically establish requirements for certain types of uses or buildings, regardless of what zone they're located in. So as you can see here on the slide in front of you, in section 6, we have specific use provisions for tiny houses, gas pumps, kennels, outdoor patios, backyard hen coops, schools, stadiums, places of worship. So there are very specific provisions that go along with those uses, regardless of where they're located in the city. Next slide, please. Section 7 are the parking, loading, and bike parking provisions. So they basically establish the minimum number of parking spaces for residential uses, the minimum number of accessible parking spaces, requirements for enhanced bike parking, the design requirements for parking spaces, driveways, drive aisles. It includes loading space requirements. It has parameters for the parking of recreational vehicles and commercial vehicles in residential zones. And the provisions of Section 7 are also connected to Schedule 2, the parking areas map. So Schedule 2 identifies various parking areas across the city. So for those minimum number of residential uses, depending where you are in the city and your location relative to transit, and we've established different parking ratios that are shown on that map. Next slide, please. So sections 8 to 19 are really the traditional sections of the zoning bylaw that connect directly to Schedule 1, the zoning map. So basically, when you're looking at what your zone is, you would probably start here, looking at what the permitted uses are, what the performance standards are in your zone, and then you would go to the other sections of the zoning bylaw. So they really establish those permitted uses in each zone and provide the corresponding performance standards, height, setbacks, lot coverage, landscaped open space, and really establish in each individual zone for each use what the expectations are. So sections 8 to 19 are all formatted in a similar manner. The first subsection of those sections, it establishes the permitted uses or buildings for every zone within that category. And then the following subsections are zone by zone. It establishes the performance standards for each zone. Next slide, please. So section 8 are the rural zones. The rural zones have been created, first and foremost, we created a new prime agricultural area zone to align with the official plan's designation of prime agricultural areas. We have a new hamlet zone, the HAM zone, aligning with the OP's designation of hamlets, which are the rural settlement areas. And then the remainder of the rural zones are largely a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws. So we have a rural zone, a rural residential zone, a limited service rural residential zone, rural commercial zone. Next slide, please. Section 9 are the rural industrial zones. So again, it's a consolidation largely of the existing zoning bylaws of the rural industrial and the mineral resource extraction zones. So we have the RM1 is the rural industrial zone, RM2 are the rural heavy industrial zone, and then MX1 is the mineral resource and extraction zone. Next slide, please. So the mixed use zones are in section 10. So the Williamsville zones are the WM1 and WM2 zones, and they're a reflection of council's approved framework for the Williamsville Main Street that was passed in December of 2020. And then the downtown zones are DT1 and DT2, and they're intended to reflect the existing zoning permissions for the downtown area, except for the Market Square HCD, which is zoned HCD2. And then it also updates the required ground floor commercial areas to align with the official plan. So Schedule 3 is the required ground floor commercial map, and that is also connected to section 15 as well. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sukriti for a couple of residential zones.
Thanks, Laura. So section 11 covers the urban residential zones, which include the low density zones in the city. UR1, UR2, and UR3 are the residential areas in subdivisions in Kingston East and Kingston West. In existing zoning bylaws 7626, 97-102, and 32-74. The UR4 zone represents the zoning framework for the Redding area that was approved by council in October of 2019. And the UR5 to UR13 zones apply to the low density residential areas within existing zoning bylaw 8499, including the Ckgs area within central Kingston. So for these zones, we did make some amendments through the Ckgs, which include removal of floor space index and lot coverage provisions, as well as we incorporated a new maximum building depth of 18 meters as measured from the minimum front setback. And also a minimum distance of 7.5 meters is proposed between the rear building wall and the rear lot line in the zones. Front yard setbacks in some areas, such as the existing A zone and the Kings Court areas, are proposed to be set at 4.5 meters with some flexibility to vary depending on the existing context. And lastly, minimum lot frontages have been included where they currently do not exist in these zones. Next slide, please. Section 12 includes the urban multi-residential zones, and URM1 and URM2 primarily apply to higher density residential areas in again in Kingston East and Kingston West. So these would be zoning bylaws 76-26, 97-102, and 32-74. The URM3 to URM7 zones apply to higher density residential areas within existing zoning bylaw 8499, which applies to Central Kingston. Through the Ckgs work, these were drafted based on existing requirements with some revisions. So the existing B zone in zoning bylaw 8499 will now be the URM3 zone. The B1 zone will be URM4. The B2 zone will be URM5. B3 will be URM6. And the B3 zone north of Williamsville will be URM7. The URM8 to URM12 zones represent areas that are proposed for upzoning through the Ckgs work. So these include the Johnson and Brock Street corridor areas as the URM8 zone, which would permit up to 6 stories of height. The Portsmouth Avenue corridor, which will be the URM9 and the URM10 zones, which would permit 4 stories. And the Sir John A. Macdonald Boulevard, Bath Road, and Wright Crescent area, which would be the URM11 and URM12 zones, which would permit 6 stories along the Wright Crescent frontage and 12 stories along the Bath Road and Sir John A. Macdonald frontages. And I do have a map later on in this presentation to show the location of these areas. Next slide, please, and I'm going to hand it back to Laura.
Thanks, Akriti. So the section 13 are the heritage zones. So there are 3 new heritage zones that have been developed specifically for the designated heritage conservation districts in the city. So HCD 1 was created through the new zoning bylaw project to reflect the Village of Berryfield HCD plan. HCD 2 reflects the existing permissions for the Market Square zone, so the CMS zone in the downtown and harbor zoning bylaw. And then HCD 3 was created through the Ckgs as well, which has proposed amendments to the existing B zone to ensure that the development reflects the Old Sydenham HCD plan. Next slide, please. So section 14 are the institutional zones, and the institutional zones are largely a reflection of the existing permissions on institutional designated lands. So they include the institutional major and minor zone, IN1 and IN2, a correctional facility zone, G1, and a military installations zone as G2. Next slide, please. Section 15 are the commercial zones. So they're primarily a consolidation of existing zone permissions with amendments where required to conform with the commercial designations in the OP and to align with the recommendations of the commercial land review. So within the commercial zones, we have the neighborhood commercial, CN, the arterial commercial, CA, the district commercial, CD, regional commercial, CR, general commercial, CG, the marine commercial, CW, and the harbor zone, which is HB. Next slide, please. Section 16 are the employment zones. So the employment zones are reflective of the employment area designations in the official plan. So the business park zone M1 aligns with the business park industrial designation. Both the general industrial zone M2 and the heavy industrial zone M3 align with the general industrial designation in the OP, and the waste management zone M5 aligns with the waste management industrial designation. We also have a new M4 zone, and that's an employment service zone, which has been applied to lands that have been zoned for service commercial uses in accordance with the complementary use policies of the official plan. Next slide, please. So the transportation and utility zones are in section 17, and it includes the airport zone, TA, the transportation and railroad zone, TR, and the utility installation or corridor zone, TU. And these have been applied across the city wherever the relevant infrastructure exists. Next slide, please. The open space zones include the protected open space, the OS1, the general open space zone, OS2, and the development reserve zone, the DR. So the OS1 applies to areas that are intended to be open spaces with no buildings permitted. The OS2 applies to parks and other open space areas where it's anticipated buildings or other equipment will be constructed. And then the DR zone generally aligns with the existing development zone in the existing zoning bylaws and some formerly industrial zone lands that have a non-industrial designation in the official plan. And it allows for existing residential uses or industrial or agricultural uses. And then future development of those properties is intended to proceed through a rezoning to establish a more appropriate zone category on those lands. Next slide, please. Finally, in the zone categories, we have environmental zones. So the EPA zone is in section 19.1. So the intent of the EPA zone is to really align with the lands that are proposed to be designated EPA through our proposed official plan amendment. And then the uses are limited to a small range of uses that align with the intent of the official plan's policies for the lands that are designated environmental protection areas. Next slide, please. Section 20 has the legacy exceptions. So those are the green exceptions that were shown on the map that I had identified earlier in the presentation. And those are really the existing site or area specific exceptions that were written under the existing zoning bylaws. So they're identified in green on that schedule with an L preceding a number. So the general framework for all of the exceptions is established in the exception overlay provisions in subsection 5.5, but then section 20 actually provides all of the text that goes along with those individual exceptions. So L1 through L491 are the legacy exceptions in section 20, and the specific permissions or restrictions that align with those existing approvals are then laid out specifically in section 20. Next slide, please. So the section 21 are the blue exceptions that you saw on that same map. So those are newly created site or area specific exceptions that we've actually written in the context of the new zoning bylaw. So we've ensured that all of the areas where it doesn't comply with the existing zoning permission, we've identified those in the exceptions. So these are necessary to properly reflect the nuances of the existing zoning permissions in certain areas of the city. So they're identified on that schedule in blue, and they have an E preceding the number on schedule E. So again, the general framework for those exceptions is established in the exception overlay provisions in subsection 5.5. And then section 21 includes the specific permissions or restrictions that apply to each one of those individual exceptions. Right now, there's 77 blue exceptions in section 21, but this is a section that will continuously be revised in the future as new site-specific exceptions or area-wide exceptions are approved by council through zoning bylaw amendments. Next slide, please. So section 22 include the holding conditions. So the existing zoning bylaws apply, it's called a holding symbol is a -H on the existing zoning map. So these have been moved into a standalone overlay. And really these are conditions that must be satisfied before you can develop a property. And they're typically connected to known or potential constraints in a certain area. So they could be established through a site-specific rezoning application or through an area-wide policy. And the general framework for these is established in that holding overlay provisions in subsection 5.6, and then section 22 identifies the specific conditions that apply to each individual property. Next slide, please. So sections 23 and 24, we're at the end of the text here. They're both right now placeholder sections. We don't have any temporary zones in effect in the municipality. So if new temporary zones are created in the future, applicable permissions or restrictions would be included in section 23. And section 24 is a list of amendments to the zoning bylaw. So as new amendments are made, they would get added into section 24. Next slide, please. So finally, let's get into the proposed official plan amendment. So there's one proposed official plan amendment bylaw, and that includes the recommendations that have been created through the new zoning bylaw project, as well as the CKGS project. So it's all been built into one proposed official plan amendment bylaw. The amendments that relate to the new zoning bylaw project specifically, we did a number of discussion papers that covered the majority of these topics at non-statutory public meetings in April and June. Additional residential units and tiny houses. So we're looking to replace the existing second residential unit permissions with additional residential unit permissions, and to replace the garden suite provisions with new tiny house provisions, and to remove the servicing constraints that are connected with the existing second residential unit provisions. So that's a map in the OP, and it's also a map in the zoning bylaw. So we're proposing to remove it from the OP in favor of the zoning bylaw mapping. We're proposing amendments to places of worship and schools to establish complementary uses in places of worship, and to really remove the funding distinction between schools. So right now the OP distinguishes between private and public schools and provides different restrictions depending on the funding model. So we're proposing amendments to remove that funding distinction, allowing the new zoning bylaw to treat all schools equally. Environmental protection areas, there's a lengthy discussion paper discussing the proposed approach to transitioning these areas, the protection of riparian corridors, so lands within 30 meters of a water body, from a map-based environmental protection area designation into a text-based requirement. The on-farm diversified uses and agricultural related uses, we're proposing to establish a more simplified process for permitting those uses, potentially through a minor variance with clearer criteria. There are complementary uses and the outdoor storage within employment areas, again, providing clarity for establishing complementary uses within employment areas, establishing a potential to allow some complementary uses as a minor variance, and then establishing clear criteria for locations for outdoor storage in those areas so we could better regulate that through the new zoning bylaw. We're proposing a new delegated authority section, which would enable council to delegate its authority to make decisions on various minor amendments to the zoning bylaw. And then there are housekeeping revisions throughout some of the texts that don't change the intent of the existing OP policies. And I'll pass it over to Sukriti on the next slide for the CKGS.
Thanks, Laura. Next slide, please. The proposed amendment related to the CKGS would create a new Central Kingston specific policy area in Section 10G of the official plan. This new Section 10G will include policies related to suitable build form, height limits, and transition from existing development, among other items, to appropriately integrate new high-density development within the proposed intensification areas, the location of which is shown on this map, and the slide includes the proposed maximum heights within these areas. Next slide, please, and I will hand it back to Laura.
Thanks, Sukriti. So the next steps on this project. So there will be a statutory public meeting held on April 7th at 6 p.m. So it's a virtual meeting at Planning Committee. So at the same meeting, Planning Committee will consider staff's recommendations in the comprehensive report. That comprehensive report and that Planning Committee agenda are actually published on the Planning Committee website at the end of the day today. So that information is now all publicly available. If Planning Committee endorses staff's recommendations on April 7th at that meeting, the recommendations would then be considered by council at a special meeting of council on April 26th. There is an opportunity to address public comments through a supplementary report to council between that April 7th and April 26th meeting. Next slide, please. So other ways to get involved, obviously we have project web pages for both the new zoning bylaw and the Central Kingston Growth Strategy. We have email lists. People have signed up for updates on both of those projects. You can email comments directly to either the new ZBL at cityofkingston.ca or ckstrategy@cityofkingston.ca. There are Get Involved Kingston pages as well for both projects. We have the statutory public meeting on April 7th at 6 p.m. or you could call me directly on my phone extension if you're looking to have a direct conversation about any questions or comments that you have on the new zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. And with that, I think I'll hand it back to Mark to facilitate some of the questions.
Great, thanks, Laura. Okay, so I do see that we have one raised hand as well, one question in the Q&A, and we do have a question in the chat as well. Just a reminder that please leave your questions in the Q&A just to make sure that we're able to track them in the order that they come in and get to them in. Having said that, the first question received, if this is a statutory meeting, does making a comment today preserve the right to appeal?
Mark, I'm happy to answer that question.
Great.
The Planning Act does make a distinction between a public meeting and an open house. The Planning Act states that the purpose of an open house is to give the public an opportunity to review and ask questions, whereas the purpose of a public meeting is to give the public an opportunity to make submissions. So the Act states that the city is required to give information to the public about appeal rights at a public meeting as opposed to an open house, and that appeal rights are limited to individuals who make submissions at a public meeting.
Great. Seeing another question in the Q&A here from Holly. Can you discuss the difference between exceptions and legacy exceptions? Will the parent zone or former parent zone apply in these instances?
Sorry, I think I'm getting an unstable connection. I'm going to turn off my video for a second here. Let me know if you can't hear my voice. The exceptions and the legacy exceptions. So we did a pretty detailed report to council in November about all of the existing site-specific exceptions. So in November, we had identified 3 different categories of exceptions. Basically, red exceptions were exceptions that were passed before our current official plan, and those exceptions may or may not conform with our official plan policies. And it was really just a matter of staff time and resources that we aren't able to go through all of those exceptions within the time allotted for this project to properly assess whether they conform with the official plan. The green exceptions were the exceptions that were passed under the existing zoning bylaws since 2010, and they were written in the context of those existing zoning bylaws. But we're confident that since they were passed, since the new official plan came into effect, that they conform with the official plan. So we don't have any official plan conformity concerns. And then the blue exceptions were new exceptions that were created in one-off scenarios to properly carry forward existing permissions and ensure that they weren't lost in the new zoning bylaw. So they were written within the context of the new zoning bylaw. So at the meeting of council in November, council had directed staff, as per our recommendation at that point in time, to exempt the older red exceptions from the new zoning bylaw and to allow those existing bylaws to apply to those properties. So those are the properties that you'll see on the map that I showed that said not subject to this bylaw. Those are the old red exceptions. Since that November meeting, we have done quite a substantial amount of work to 3 of the urban residential zones. So the UR1, UR2, and UR3 zones were substantially modified in response to the feedback that we received at our statutory public meeting that we had in October. So through that work in creating the new UR1, UR2, and UR3 zones, we created a series of new blue exceptions that align with existing exceptions on those lands. So you'll actually see quite a few residential subdivisions have new blue exceptions which were created specifically by staff. So a number of older exceptions were actually replaced with new blue exceptions. So really the difference between right now the legacy exceptions, which are the green exceptions, and the new blue exceptions is that the new blue exceptions have been written in the context of the new zoning bylaw, whereas the older green legacy exceptions were written under the existing zoning bylaws. So there are some interpretation provisions in the exception overlay. So in subsection, I believe it's 5.5, it includes the some transition allowing for reference back to the existing zoning bylaws to assist in the interpretation of those legacy exceptions. So the green and the blue exceptions will all be subject to the new zoning bylaw, but there is just different interpretation related to the two of them.
Okay, great. We do have a raised hand from Barbara. Barbara, I've gone ahead and unmuted you. You can go ahead and share your question.
Hello, this is Barbara and Marcel Samard. We live at 115 Wright Crescent, unit number 61. And my first comment is regarding the slides. The information is very informative. And as I mentioned at the last Zoom meeting, it would have been beneficial to provide those slides in advance of the meeting. Anyone who is signed on to this session would normally review all of that material beforehand and be prepared to ask questions. The next thing I would like to say is that the residents of the Wright Crescent area have provided comments, a number of comments, and quite a number of people. There's been absolutely no reflection of the comments from the owners in the Wright Crescent area in the final plan that is going forward. There was also no public engagement that specifically targeted the owners and residents living in the Wright Crescent area. And by that, I mean the 80 owners of property who live along Wright Crescent at 115 and also 130 Wright Crescent, which is a condo apartment building. The next thing I want to say is that because we have not received any feedback or any reflection of our comments in the plan that is going forward, there is a working group that is undertaken to create a petition to formulate all and put together all of the comments that have been sent to the city in a petition that will be presented to City Council. There are a number of people involved in this working group who may not be living here by the time all of these plans come into effect. Some may have retired, some may have moved on. However, we do care about our community and we do care about the neighborhood. The major concerns of traffic and green space, the loss of green space, as well as a community garden, which people have enjoyed for over 20 years, that will be gone as well. And so we are very concerned about the lack of response to all of the comments that have been made and sent in by people who have spent a lot of time thinking about this. So this is just to advise anyone listening, if you want to join this petition, Barbara Samard, 115 Wright Crescent, Unit 61. And we have a group working on this, and we are going to present our concerns in response to this plan to City Council. The final comment is, there's been a lot of discussion about this taking place, this planning taking place for the last 6 years. It's only very, very recently that we have found out about it. Now, some people say you should get involved, you should be on the email or on the website and all of this stuff. Well, the reality is people are busy, they have busy lives, and then COVID came into the equation. So it is really important that City Council understand that this is a major, major endeavor. The other final comment I will make is that the development on Upper Princess Street is absolutely ugly. And we do not want more ugly being brought into the Wright Crescent area. There is absolutely no need for those high-rise buildings, traffic flow onto Wright Crescent, no green space. We don't want this neighborhood to look like downtown Toronto. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara. Sukriti, would you be able to speak to that?
Yes, thanks, Mark. And thank you, Barbara, for your comments. With respect to the materials being available, we posted everything on the city's website on March 9th, and we had also provided email communication regarding the availability of all of the materials on the city's website. With respect to specific responses to comments that we have received, with respect to the proposed intensification area on Wright Crescent, Sir Johnny and Bath Road, we've included a comment and response matrix within our, as an exhibit to the comprehensive report, and that comment and response matrix was also made available on March 9th in Dash as part of this project. So I would really recommend that you read through it, but just going through some of the comments that you've provided today regarding traffic. So from what information was presented at the public meeting in December last year, we have made some amendments to the policies within this area. So for example, there was one policy which specifically prohibited entrances to those intensification areas from Sir John and MacDonald Boulevard and Bath Road. We have removed that prohibition in response to the feedback that was received, and we will be reviewing entrances onto these sites as and when development applications come in consultation with staff from transportation services. There was also a comment you made about green space. And again, that is something that we will review when new development applications come in as part of parkland dedication requirements that are required by the Planning Act. You mentioned something about the petition, and I believe we did provide a response on that piece today, this morning. And I also just wanted to mention with respect to those sites that are being proposed for intensification on Wright Crescent and Sir John A. MacDonald Boulevard and Bath Road. So those sites are already in a zone that allows for some higher density development. And if those sites were developed in accordance with the zoning framework that is in place today, they would be able to get the heights that we are proposing through this amendment. So the main intent of our amendments is to more clearly define an appropriate build form for that area, taking into consideration the existing development on Wright Crescent on the other side of the street, which does include the townhouse development. As compared to what's there in the zoning bylaw today, that doesn't really have that type of consideration, like as it relates to transition between these sites and the existing development. Thank you.
Okay, we'll just chronologically, we'll switch to the Q&A now. I do see a few additional questions. So Peter is asking, can you give more info on opportunities for public input? Well, I'm not sure if you're able to speak to that.
Certainly, thanks, Mark. We have the statutory public meeting coming up at the meeting of Planning Committee on April 7th. You can submit any kind of written comments via email to me at newzbl@cityofkingston.ca. You can feel free to give me a call. I'm made myself available throughout the course of this project. Anytime someone would like to discuss any of their questions over the phone in a virtual meeting, we can talk about any of your specific questions or comments one-on-one, not in a public format if you would prefer that type of consultation with me. And then it's really submitting any kind of written comments that you have at this point in time via email. Thank you.
Great, and we have another question from Rachel. I think in a previous iteration of the GIS mapping, Schedule E, there were red site-specific exceptions. Are those red areas now the gray areas labeled NA subject to this bylaw?
Yes, thanks, Rachel. So this is connected with the response that I had provided earlier. So yes, the majority of those red site-specific exceptions that were previously shown on the second draft mapping are now shown as NA. If you're really zoomed out on the map and if you zoom into the map, it's not subject to this bylaw. So there's corresponding text in section 1 of the zoning bylaw that repeals the existing zoning bylaws, except for those portions that apply to the properties that are not subject to this bylaw. Thank you.
And a question from Vicky. The OP amendments, the slide said, enable council to delegate its authority to make decisions on various minor amendments to the zoning bylaw. Could you please explain this? Maybe an example of the delegation that could occur?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So in the proposed official plan amendment, this is a new authority in the Planning Act that was recently passed that allows minor zoning bylaw amendments to be delegated to a specific staff member or a different committee rather than council. So through this work, we've identified a lot of technical revisions that may need to happen in the future that it would be efficient to delegate to the Director of Planning Services rather than having to go to council for approval. So this is a recommendation in the comprehensive report that has been released today. The types of minor zoning bylaw amendments that we've identified are the removal of additional residential unit constraint areas. So that additional residential unit overlay has a number of constraint areas that are connected to mostly servicing constraints that are known and through our consultation with Utilities Kingston. So within those constraint areas, there might also be sewer surcharging areas where there can't be additional residential units in the basement in certain locations. So as utilities are upgraded and those servicing constraints are removed and we get confirmation that there's no longer a constraint area, that would be one of the minor zoning bylaw amendments that we're proposing be delegated to the Director of Planning Services. So actually just updating that additional residential unit overlay. Amendments to the floodplain overlay when new floodplain information becomes available. So we coordinate really closely with the CRCA on the floodplain overlay and ensure that it aligns with the regulatory floodplain in accordance with the CRCA. So any time that updated or new information related to that regulation would be available to us. That's a technical amendment that we're proposing to make. Amendments related to the severance of surplus farm dwellings. So if there's a surplus farm dwelling that gets severed through a consent process at the Committee of Adjustment, there's often a requirement that the property be rezoned. As a very much a technical piece of that severance. So we're proposing that those severance of surplus farm dwellings would be delegated to the Director of Planning Services. And then amendments required to bring the existing site-specific zones from the former zoning bylaws that conform with the official plan into the new zoning bylaw. So that would be those red exceptions that are shown as not subject to this bylaw, being able to bring those from the existing bylaw into the new zoning bylaw in a manner that's consistent with the official plan would be one of those technical amendments that we're proposing to delegate through this work.
Okay, great, thanks. And we have a question here from Gord. Why is the height limit on the Brock and Johnson Street corridor 6 stories rather than 4 in other zones? Existing buildings are 2 to 3 stories, so permitted buildings would be approximately twice as high. This will create a Brock Street tunnel with 6-story buildings on each side.
Thank you, Gord, for that comment. So we are proposing 6 stories along the Brock and Johnson Street corridors, 4 stories in the Portsmouth Avenue area, and then 6 and 12 stories in the Wright Crescent and Sir John A. Macdonald and Bath Road areas. So the reason we chose 6 stories was like initially we were looking at a larger area for intensification, but then through our review of that area, we needed to study it a bit more because of existing servicing constraints, and we landed on 6 stories, mainly to also like we were also looking at the financial viability of that area, and 4 stories wouldn't likely have been financially viable in the area, given that intensification will require lot consolidation. And that's how we are proposing 6 stories at this time. And then we will be reviewing the larger area for intensification as part of our future official plan update work or through a future density by design project phase. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're gonna do one more question from the Q&A here, and then we will move back to the raised hands. I see that there are currently 3 at this point in time. AJ is asking, the mayor's task force on housing called upon this zoning bylaw update work to help increase the housing supply. If this bylaw is passed, how many new approved units will be allowed as of right versus the 5 separate bylaws?
Thanks for the question. So the scope of the project was primarily formatted as a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaws. So this is scoped through work that was done back in 2013, and a project scope that was originally agreed to with a project consultant in 2015. And it was very much intended to be a reflection of the existing zoning permissions. So through the work that we've done as staff in the 3rd and final phase, with no longer with an outside consultant, but all in-house and planning staff, we've made a lot of advancements beyond just a consolidation of the existing zoning bylaw to ensure that the new zoning bylaw really starts to reflect the vision for growth in the official plan. So through this work, obviously, we're introducing permissions for additional residential units across the city. So that changes the permission from 2nd residential units, which is just 1 additional residential unit on a property, to 2 additional residential units on any property that has a single detached house, a semi-detached house, or a townhouse across the city. So obviously, the introduction of those new permissions, it applies on every single semi or townhouse citywide. Through the Ckgs work, the proposed intensification sites, and Sukriti can jump in after my response here, would introduce permissions for from between 2,000 to 4,000 new units. We're also proposing to pre-zone lands that are in future subdivision areas. So areas that have been specifically planned for future subdivision that would have otherwise had to go through a rezoning application. We're proposing to pre-zone a number of lands with specific exceptions that would require a minimum density to be met. I don't have the exact number of new units that could potentially be created on those lands that are being pre-zoned through this work, but it is certainly a substantial number of new units that could be developed through this work. Thank you.
Okay, at this point in time, we can switch to the raised hands. Again, there are 3 individuals. Just a reminder that at this point, we are addressing primarily questions from members of the public. We will have an opportunity to share comments as well. However, we just want to make sure that we're able to get to and address everyone's questions. Okay, first raised hand is Donald. Donald, go ahead. You've been invited to unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can.
Great, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to say all of us should be saying in the public a huge bravo to staff. And so I just want to extend on behalf of a lot of us that have engaged the thanks. I remember back many years ago, maybe it was 2015, but talking about things like functionality and simplifying things, these interactive maps, intelligent document that some cities like Ottawa seem to have. And I think it's really headed in that direction. So I wanted to say that and thank you very much on behalf of the public. Second thing I wanted to indicate was that staff does appear that they have been responsive. And if I got the codes right, the URM9 and URM10 intensification areas were actually shifted because of response to the public. I just wondered whether or not that shortfall in that area was picked up somewhere else, or is that just a loss of an indication of density for those areas? And then my third question these are a little more nuanced maybe, but I I wondered in the change of standards, it seemed to be before, and I'm hoping it's still there, but in the areas of like UR5 to UR13, my impression was that there was some modest increase in square footage, for example, in the way that the standard shifted. It wasn't holding status quo, it was allowing for a little bit greater square footage in those areas. And I just wondered whether that is actually true of the document now. And then I think I just have one more comment. Since 2018 and things that have happened in the world, we're trending in different directions. And I just wondered if staff could comment on mixed use. And I'm wondering about how existing mixed use, like little commercial stores, laundromats, et cetera, in the UR5 to 13 areas are handled, and whether or not the document contemplates adding uses like that on corridors and things near residential areas. And then the second one is this trend that seems to be happening where in areas which I think would be URM 3 to 7 in sort of the areas that I live, are those going to contemplate mixed uses that might be anything from commercial, small, low-level commercial to live, work, places where you might have these co-working stations within a residential building, et cetera. Thank you again. Great work. I appreciate the opportunity to comment.
Don, thank you for your comments. So with respect to your question on removal of the Johnson Street portion near Portsmouth from the intensification areas, we have not, like I would say, compensated like that loss in some other area at this point. However, like I mentioned, we will be looking at the campus expansion area north of Queen's University in addition to a larger area through the next OP update and review it for potential intensification. Your next question around the UR5 and to UR13 zones and whether there was a modest increase in square footage permitted through the amendments. So what we have done is included a maximum building depth of 18 meters, which will be measured from the required front setback for properties within these zones. So when we tested, we tested varied lot sizes within various zones located in central Kingston. And in some cases, it may result in a reduced square footage as compared to existing. And in some cases, it was actually resulting in a greater square footage as compared to existing. So the main idea was to allow some level of intensification, sorry, not intensification, I mean like some level of redevelopment and additions to existing properties within these areas, because since we've started the Ckgs, the province also amended the Planning Act with respect to additional residential units. So, so we were looking at a more equitable approach that would allow some level of redevelopment or additions on within the low density area, within the low density areas to be able to accommodate additional residential units where property owners are looking to establish those. With respect to your question around mixed uses in these low density zones, so there are certain types of non-residential uses that would be permitted in these areas. However, they don't necessarily include commercial type of uses. Those are more like community facilities type of uses. So our official plan includes specific policies for neighborhood commercial uses in section 3.4.f, which mainly indicate that neighborhood commercial uses can be established through a zoning bylaw amendment. So in consideration of that policy, we have not included like as of right permissions anywhere. There's a set of criteria within the OP which specifically speaks to neighborhood commercial uses. So we would have to review applications for like, for example, a laundromat or a corner store. So we would have to review them on a side-by-side basis, and that's why we have not included like as of right permissions. And I think I've addressed all of your questions. I think you also had one question around the URM you mentioned URM 3 to 7. So those are the existing B type zones, so B, B1, B2 zones in 8499. And again, within these areas, we have not included as of right permissions for commercial type of uses. However, there are community facility type of uses that would be permitted, like for example, like a community facility or a library. And I'd have to look back into the zoning bylaw with respect to exactly what is that list of non-residential uses permitted within these zones, but it doesn't include commercial type of uses. Thank you.
Okay, great. And we have two other raised hands here. Okay, Peter, go ahead. You've been unmuted.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to, I'm sorry, can you, I have an echo.
Yep, we're just getting a bit of an echo, but we can hear you.
This. So, sorry for that false and awkward start. I wanted to refer to the purpose of intensification, understanding the value of avoiding sprawl into the countryside and many benefits of intensification. I think there's appropriate and inappropriate applications of this, and I live in an area on Wright Crescent that I believe is a perverse effect of the intensification. If the purpose is to create an urban canyon ghetto, I think you may succeed. We have, referring to the city of Kingston, one of the council's strategic priorities is to foster healthy citizens in vibrant spaces. Kingston views all long-term residents and newcomers as citizens of the city, and it's committed to exclusively engaging them in local solutions that enhance health, well-being, and the experience of the city. So I'm looking at urban map number 62. And if you look at UM4, which is the low-rise townhouses of 80 units, and URM5, which is a senior citizens complex, the Kinsman Seniors Residence. We're creating a bit of an urban ghetto canyon. We have 3 UMR 12 and 3 URM 11s surrounding URM 4. Also in the area marked not applicable is a large high rise. There's L152, which is being constructed as we speak, and the poor senior citizens right across the road have been subjected to 8 hours of block breaking, pounding 5 days a week. L370 is another apartment building surrounding it that is just finishing completion. So I do not want an answer at this point, because I think it would take up more time than we want to involve. But I like that the city planners relook at what they're creating. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments, Peter. We're also seeing another raised hand from David. David, you've been unmuted. You can go ahead.
Hi there. It's actually Helen Chadwick with my husband David Johnson here. So I also am would like to ask some questions about the Wright Crescent decisions. I'm happy to hear, thank you, that currently what's allowed could be potentially larger and more visually disruptive than what the new guidelines at least will permit. So I'm happy to hear that there has been some consideration given to that. I still would question some of the decisions. And so we're wondering how the committee arrived at setting a minimum streetscape, for example, of 4 floors. And I guess what my question is has there been consideration to, we need to intensify, obviously. We've got it's great areas, it's climate friendly. This is a really wonderful location for people to access transit, to access many needed services. But we need to intensify with a diversification of housing types. And so not only provide apartment options as growth in the urban area, because at the same time, then we're pushing other types of houses now out, sort of townhouses and duplexes, et cetera, out to the suburbs. And while I respect that the developments potentially on Portsmouth are 4-story and the ones down on Brock and Johnson, but we know that those are in student areas. And so that those houses will be largely attractive to students. But if we're looking at areas like Innovation Park, where the city is interested in developing some, along with Queens, some incubator type businesses, some technical businesses, creating some real employment hubs in those areas, we're going to have young professionals, people who want that, to be a property owner. And I would say similar to the townhouses that we're in right now, be a property owner without necessarily being in an apartment building. So I guess my question is, was there consideration given to the concept of the missing middle? Where are the duplexes, the fourplexes, even some of those quadrangular, sorry for my language there, type buildings that are 3 and 4 stories, but make good use of space, leave some green space, and not have necessarily these minimum 4 stories and allow for these heights of 12 stories, which are out of proportion to the single story and the 2 and 3 story townhouses. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Laura or Sukriti, would you be able to speak to that?
Yes, thanks, Mark. I can speak to that. Thank you so much for your comments. With respect to your consideration, the question around missing middle and whether we considered that, like allowing duplexes or 3 units on a property. So not exactly in like what we normally like would call a missing middle format, but through the new zoning bylaw, we are including permissions for additional residential units that would allow up to 3 units on a property. So 2 units could be within the main dwelling, and then 1 unit could be within a detached building. However, with respect to including, for example, as of right permissions for triplexes or 4 units on a lot, we have not included that like across the whole central Kingston area, but the area that is proposed for intensification on Portsmouth Avenue, that could potentially accommodate that type of a building form. So in that area, we are proposing a maximum of 4 stories, and that could be in a townhouse type of a format, like a stacked townhouse format, or in a low-rise apartment building. Specifically as it relates to the Wright Crescent and Sir John A. Macdonald and Bath Road area, we looked at 6 stories and 12 stories. So we applied some of the learning that from our work on the Williamsville Main Street corridor around requiring a 4-story street wall. And the main intent of requiring that 4 stories street wall is also to provide a transition to the 2 and 3 story townhouses on Wright Crescent, instead of like a transition right from 6 stories to the townhouses. We also looked at the intervening street, which is Wright Crescent, which would function as a transition between that height and the existing townhouses on Wright Crescent. And as I mentioned previously in response to another comment, the zoning for those properties already allow for a building that could be as tall as 12 stories. So we were really trying to, as I mentioned, dictate a more appropriate build form, which would only allow 6 stories along the Wright Crescent frontage instead of the existing permissions that could allow for 12 stories along the Wright Crescent frontage. Thank you.
Okay, great. Denise, we do see a raised hand. However, in the interest of getting to things chronologically, we're just going to jump back to the Q&A here. We do have a question from David. Just give me one moment here. So David is asking, what is happening with the design guidelines for intensification that were developed in the Central Kingston Growth Study? The advisory committee spent several years working on them in hopes that they would be used to guide intensification in the future. Could they be turned into a set of urban design guidelines adopted by council to guide intensification in the future? Sukriti, are you able to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And thanks, Dave, for that comment. So the urban design guidelines will be brought in with the future official plan review. So when we reviewed those design guidelines that were prepared as part of the Ckgs work, it became apparent to us that we could appropriately apply some of those guidelines to beyond the Ckgs study area. And we thought that there is the opportunity to bring in some of those guidelines as official plan policies as part of the future OP update. So that's why we haven't yet, we are not proposing to use them separately. Rather, we propose to bring them as OP policy in the future.
Okay, and seeing one other question from Josephine, similar to Mr. Simon's question, but with regards to a 12-story height allowance in the Wright Crescent Sir John A corridor, how is this excessive height justified?
So thank you again for that comment. And as I just mentioned in response to a couple of previous comments, the existing zoning for those properties already allows for that type of height to be accommodated on the site. So that would also depend on the building footprint and the setbacks that are required from the property lines. But like I mentioned, we were looking at a more appropriate build form within that area to also be able to provide appropriate transition to Wright Crescent. Additionally, this site is on, these sites are on an arterial road, so that includes Sir John A. Macdonald and Bath Road. These are highly walkable in close proximity or right across actually from Kingston Center. There are also some existing developments in that area which are around that height. So we were looking at it in a more holistic area, like kind of really looking at this area as a node for future intensification, given that it's adjacent to amenity areas in close proximity. Thank you.
Okay, great. And we have another question from Paul. I'm not sure if I missed it, but where's the requirement for a developer to include green space within their development? The city has an environmental and climate crisis plan, and most current developments do not address the climate crisis, especially where developers are clear-cutting large sections of green space. Thank you.
I can jump in here and give security a break for a minute. So in the new zoning bylaw, the performance standards that are applied in the various zones include specific requirements for landscaped open space. So a minimum percentage of a property must be provided as landscaped open space. There are also provisions that regulate the built form and the size of the building on the property relative to the lot lines. So lot coverage and setbacks are something that are intended to ensure that the size of the building is appropriate relative to the property. There are specific requirements for landscaped planting strips in certain non-residential developments that would be close to residential properties. So the zoning bylaw doesn't specifically include, the words climate change or an environmental crisis plan within the provisions. But when you look at the size and scale of the property and the requirement to ensure that that landscaped open space is there, that's one of the ways that the zoning bylaw is able to ensure that any new developments include that green space. There are also with residential developments, minimum amenity space requirements, and those take shape in many different forms on a property. Site-specific developments, that's part of the review process, and certainly I would invite James Barr to jump in here, the manager of development approvals, to speak specifically to requirements for developers to include green spaces within their development through that site-specific process as well.
Thank you, Laura. Even through the site-specific process, there are base parent zones, which we use to create the site-specific zone for whatever comes forward. One of those areas that we have been firm on, especially with new residential development, is maintaining the landscaped open space requirement at 30% or whatever it is in the zone in order to actually maintain green open space on a development. The landscaped open space also serves multiple functions for a property. It helps with their stormwater reporting, so reducing runoff on a site. It also doubles as outdoor amenity area for projects, so residents can have access to green space, because for larger developments, we do have a per square meter requirement for amenity area per unit. That can be met multiple ways, either through rooftop amenity, through private patios, and through at-grade amenity area in the form of landscaped open space, should it meet all the requirements for it. So those requirements are key and important, even when we're reviewing site-specific development applications.
Great, thanks, James. We have an additional question from Megan, who is asking, how will non-car accessibility be planned for, especially for vulnerable road users, particularly regarding the need for accessible parking to include secure e-bike facilities, which are increasingly becoming the mobility mode chosen by disabled people, and for the frequent practice of cars blocking access to curb cuts or veering into unsegregated bike gutters. The parking paper talks about accessible motor vehicle parking with a separate part about bikes, but how will they be integrated with plans such as safe routes to school, age-friendly communities, and other access programs?
I think this is a great question, and so thank you for ensuring that we specifically touch on this topic in this presentation. So the new zoning bylaw, obviously we did a substantial amount of work on the parking discussion paper. So obviously you've read the parking discussion paper, but for those of you who are on the call who haven't read it, it's called The Power of Parking, a New Parking Paradigm for Kingston. So very much one of the focuses of the work that we've done is to ensure that non-car alternative modes of transportation are supported through the new zoning bylaw project. So Section 7 establishes the minimum parking ratios and the minimum bike parking ratios, specifically enhanced bike parking facilities. So through the work that we did in the Power of Parking and through some additional amendments that we've made to the final draft of the new zoning bylaw, we are requiring secure bike parking facilities to be provided on private developments. So there are number of enhanced facilities, so requiring a certain percentage of secure bike lockers and oversized bike spaces for those cargo bikes, ensuring that there are e-bike charging facilities within those enhanced bike parking rooms, and ensuring that the infrastructure is provided in the private sector in locations that would support safe routes to school, age-friendly communities, and other access programs. So obviously the zoning bylaw itself really regulates that private form of development, and it doesn't regulate, the public realm, the city's right of way. We've worked really closely with our colleagues in transportation services and engineering services to ensure that the provisions that we're requiring in the zoning bylaw on those private properties work really well with their plans for active transportation routes in the future and their active transportation goals and objectives in the future. So, the zoning bylaw ensures that site triangles are required to be provided on corner lots, which is really intended to ensure that there's safe visibility for those pedestrian access routes. We've included specific provisions that really recognize developments that are actually within a walkable distance to transit, and ensure that the zoning provides or gives opportunities for less car parking spaces in those locations that are close to transit. We also have established a new cash in lieu of parking bylaw that we're proposing through this work, which would allow for less parking to be provided if a property owner pays the city money to help support the establishment of a broader car share network across the city. So really helping to support the establishment of a broad car sharing system, which would help to alleviate the need to have a private automobile in a number of circumstances, or the need to have a second private automobile for your family situation. So I think throughout the entire zoning bylaw itself in section 7, we've really tried to focus our tools in zoning on supporting active transportation and transit over the private automobile.
Okay, we have one more question in the Q&A, and then we'll move to the raised hands, and then we can jump back to the Q&A. David is asking, we understand that the existing zoning on Wright Crescent currently allows for a 12-story built form. However, this extensive review presented an opportunity for creativity and to zone for more compatible scale with the current built form on Wright Crescent, which again includes 1, 2, and 3-story buildings, specifically 82 and 3-story townhouses will be directly facing 6 and 12-story buildings being allowed for in the new zoning.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, David, for that comment, for the questions again. Yes, I did mention that the existing zoning could allow for 12 stories. However, the existing zoning actually does not have a maximum height limit, so it could, depending on the area of some of the lots, it could actually result in a building that is greater than 12 stories in height. So through the proposed zoning, we are actually locking the height at 12 stories. And then also, as I mentioned, like we looked at this area in general, like as a node, given the fact that there are existing apartment buildings within this area. So I think the closest one being just north of the Calvin Park Library. And then also, like I said, given the fact that the existing zoning allows for that, and we were trying to more appropriately propose a build form that would be more appropriate for that area. Thank you.
Okay, and just switching to the raised hands, I see a raised hand from Vicky. Go ahead, you've been unmuted. You can go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me, or did I remute myself?
Nope, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. I guess I have 3 things I want to bring up. One, I really like the maps and the drawings. in the zoning bylaw and the way it's laid out. It is really much easier to read than it could be if it was all dense, and the explanation of what side yard is and all of that is really nicely done. So congratulations on that. I do want to ask about the bike parking, because if I've looked at it quickly and if I understood it, it suggested that 50% of bike parking for an apartment building, for instance, or a multi-use building could be uncovered and outside. And that is just totally not acceptable. Bikes are stolen in the city at an alarming rate. And you're just like, yes, a visitor to a building needs outside parking, but otherwise you need to have your bicycle locked inside, ideally in a storage locker, or at least in a room that is only accessible by key with a camera there. And I just would like staff to comment on how that ended up with 50% outside, or did I misread it? And then I have a question about the open space zoning, but I don't know if I should ask it now or wait.
Thanks, Vicki. I'll jump in on the bike parking ratio. So in the bike parking section in the table, it breaks down the requirement for residential bike parking spaces between long-term bike spaces and short-term bike spaces. So for every one residential unit, 0.9 spaces need to be a long-term bike space and 0.1 spaces need to be a short-term bike space. So up to 10% of those parking spaces on that property that would be required would be short-term bike spaces, and the short-term bike spaces are intended to support visitors to that property. So the long-term bike spaces are required to be covered and secure facilities. So it wouldn't be 50%, it would only be the 10% that would be the short-term that are intended for those convenience trips, not the long-term bike parking.
Okay, I'll have to look at that again. And my other question is about the open space zone, which the number one zone, the really protected zone, which I think is limited to passive recreation. And I just am wondering, I know in some places there's off-road cycling takes place, and it's organized by a club and they do off-road cycling. And if it's on private property that is zoned open space, I can understand that that's permissible, but I'm very, very concerned about off-road cycling in open space areas that are EPA areas, or, well, they're not EPA, but open space, that is really meant for passive recreation, which because of the nature that's there, usually often it's to extend the riparian area or to have a nice nature space, and off-road cycling can really tear that up. So I'm curious as to why the definition of passive recreation doesn't eliminate off-road cycling as a possible passive recreation.
Thanks, Vicki. I think that's a great question. So in the OS1 zone, so obviously we've permitted passive recreation, and we've worked with you specifically on the inclusion of a specific definition for passive recreation to align with the official plan policies. I think the zoning bylaw is really, when you're looking at land uses are very different than activities. So it's a really challenging component to regulate through zoning and to ensure that it's enforced properly. It's something that we're continuing to have internal conversations specifically about in response to your comments. So I wouldn't give you a firm response on whether it's something that we could incorporate into the final draft, but it is something that we are looking at within that definition of passive recreation to ensure that the land use versus activity conversation is appropriately addressed.
That gives rise to a last question. I don't mean to take so much time, but you're suggesting that the draft that we now have before us can still be amended. That would be a small example of excluding off-road cycling. Or saying that off-road cycling could only be on a path, a given, city established path, presuming that most open space is city space. What is the status of the zoning bylaw now? You've clearly heard some people tonight who have concerns about the height limits on Brock Street, around Wright Crescent. I'm sure there are other people in the city who are slowly going to wake up to what is being proposed in their neighborhood. How are you going to be responding to this with the plan to bring this to council at the end of April?
Thanks, Vicky. That's a great question. So obviously, these two projects have been they've been happening for a long time. On the new zoning bylaw, the first draft of the new zoning bylaw was released in 2016. We have had extensive consultation, both like non-statutory public meetings, events, participating in conversations with members of the public, various stakeholders over the course of the last 6 years. The project was put on hold for a number of years in there to allow for the official plan update project and the Ckgs projects to proceed to a point where the Ckgs could be incorporated into the final version of the zoning bylaw. So there was a hold for quite a long period of time connected with that. But for the last 18 months, we've been working on the third and final phase of the new zoning bylaw and have participated in extensive public consultation. So at this phase, we have released the final draft of the zoning bylaw. It was released to the public on March 9th. The comprehensive report is going to Planning Committee on April 7th. There will be a public meeting at Planning Committee on April 7th, but Planning Committee will be considering the recommendations that staff have included in that comprehensive report at that same public meeting. So part of the recommendations that staff have included in that comprehensive report, that the final recommendations be forwarded to the April 26th meeting of City Council for their consideration. We have indicated that there is an opportunity between that April 7th public meeting and that April 26th special meeting of council to complete a supplementary report if there were minor tweaks that needed to be made to address the public feedback. So it's very much dependent on the feedback that we receive at that public meeting at Planning Committee on April 7th, extent of any of those changes that we would be sending at a staff to respond to it. But for all intents and purposes, the final draft has already been posted, and it would be minor changes that may be recommended at this point in time. Thank you.
And Planning Committee recommend or pass a motion to require a change to be made?
I might pass that over to our city solicitor, Jenna Morley, to respond to any of the changes that Planning Committee could direct.
Thank you. The role of Planning Committee is simply to make a recommendation to council. So a recommendation will be put forth to the Planning Committee, and they can choose to either amend that recommendation in some way, to accept and approve the recommendation, or to send it up to council with a negative recommendation.
So no specific, like just take example, my off-road cycling. Planning Committee, councillors on Planning Committee are not in a position to say, direct staff to say we want to include that. That would say we want a 10-story height limit at Wright Crescent or 4 stories on Brock Street.
No, since their role is advisory in nature, staff could take into consideration the comments that are made by the committee at that meeting and make additional changes through a supplemental report, but the committee itself wouldn't have the ability to make amendments to the zoning bylaw.
Are you sure? That seems extraordinary, because Planning Committee is representing the public.
Right, and they can modify the recommendation that has been put before them, and that recommendation would go to council for approval or not.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, and seeing that we have one final question in the Q&A from Barbara. Barbara's asking, and I believe this pertains to a series of questions a little back, but why would the city want to get rid of a 20+ year old community garden on Wright Crescent facing Bath Road? Do you even know that it's there? Barb, smart. Sukriti, would you be able to answer that?
Yes, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Barbara, for that question. So the city is not proposing to get rid of the community garden. It's on private property, and it would be up to the property owner if they choose to redevelop their property based on the proposed zoning framework, provided that that zoning framework is approved by council. There may be an opportunity to incorporate that community garden within the design of the development, but like at this time, the city is not getting rid of the community garden. Thanks.
Okay, great. We're just doing a final look here for any questions. Recognizing that we have essentially run through the majority of questions at this point in time. Also, if anyone has any comments, you are welcome to share them at this point in time. At this point, we are aiming for an 8 p.m. cutoff. However, there are several means that we can collect comments from members of the public. Again, you can email them to news@bl@cityofkingston.ca. You can also leave them on Get Involved Kingston on the new zoning bylaw project page for the duration of the session, or you can raise your hand and share your comments. So we do see a question from Peter in the chat. New developments at 11 and 27 Wright Crescent have no green space at all. L152 and L370 legacy exceptions, but still recent and oversight seems to have been absent. Will there be expropriation?
Hi, everyone. I can speak to the first question about 11 and 27 Wright Crescent. So in the current zoning bylaw 8499, the exceptions are written as they have like a title block at the top, which basically notes which exception it is to the parent zone. And so the original parent zone in the old bylaws is the B1 zone. And with the way the zone is written, the exception is only overriding specific sections of the bylaw, not necessarily in its entirety the way it's written. So the 30% landscaped open space requirement of the B1 zone still applies. As Laura pointed out in the earlier part of the presentation about the mapping and the way it's layered, how everyone has a parent zone and the exception layer applies on top. If you read the L152 zone, it doesn't say anything about landscaped open space requirement in there. However, the landscaped open requirement of the parent zone would still apply. So 30% still does apply. And I've been looking at both of the landscape plans and site plans for those developments. They do meet their 30% landscaped open space. I understand that 27 Wright Crescent is currently under construction, so they may not have instituted all of the landscaping around the building, but those works will be proceeding once the weather is cooperative, and then additional landscaping will be developed for 11 Wright Crescent once the development actually proceeds through to construction and then final site works.
Great. Tim, would you be able to comment on the expropriation piece?
Yes, certainly, Mark. Yes, the only time a municipality would be expropriating lands would be for a municipal purpose, such as a widening of a road or a new roadway or the building of a city facility. And they would have to have the justification to be able to do that through the official plan.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Okay. At this point, we don't see any raised hands, questions in the chat, or questions in the Q&A. We can give it a moment just to see if anyone does have any questions or comments they would like to share at this point in time. Having said that, we are getting close to the 8 p.m. mark. Okay, and we do see a raised hand from David. Okay, you've been unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, just again, I know it was responded to the question by Vicky in regards to what the possibilities are for moving forward and what meeting this is going to, but could you just run by that again? So there could be, at this point in time, there would be no changes. The committee would just either be, the planning committee would just either be supporting or not supporting the staff recommendation, but it would still go forward to council and council would vote on it. Could somebody please clarify that once again for us? Thank you.
I can answer that. So a recommendation will be made to the planning committee through the report. The planning committee has the ability to approve that recommendation, to reject that recommendation and send it to council with a negative vote, or the committee has the ability to modify the recommendation in some way.
Okay, great. And we have an additional question raised from Colleen. Colleen, you can go ahead.
Turn that down. Hello?
Hi, Colleen, we can hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just have a question about some of the rezoning that's being proposed for intensification. I'm just wondering about how it's considered that some of the lot sizes are small for the proposed intensity or the increased intensity, and the potential therefore for developers to have to accumulate multiple lots. So I'm just wondering about what kind of review is taking place to consider the size of the lots as they currently exist when looking at or proposing increased intensity. Now, I guess how I'm saying that is a little bit confused. I guess if I'm looking at a lot that is currently like a bungalow or a single detached unit, and some of the zoning is being proposed for 3 or 4 story buildings, to me, that seems like a very political undertaking that you're saying that that by rezoning that they will no longer be single detached, and therefore they would have to be bought up in order to develop. Thank you.
Thanks, Colleen. Sukriti or Laura, would you be able to address that?
Yes, thanks, Mark. I can address it. So, Colleen, thanks for the question. So, for the Portsmouth Avenue area and the intensification areas along Brock Street and Johnson Street, we do recognize that the lot areas are fairly small to be able to accommodate the proposed intensification and the envisioned build form for those areas. So what we've proposed is a minimum lot area. So that would require the consolidation of lots to be able to realize that type of development. But in the meantime, the existing development can continue. So that doesn't mean that the existing, like single detached homes or whatever is there currently will cease to exist or they cannot continue anymore. So that's not really the intent. But for future intensification to be realized, like I mentioned, those lots would need to be consolidated. So it could be 3 to 4 lots that may need to be consolidated to be able to achieve that minimum lot area and the proposed development.
Thanks, Sukriti. We do see one question in the Q&A from Barbara. I believe Tim is actually typing a response to that question. So we'll give him a moment to do that. At this point in time, it is 8:01 p.m. We don't see any additional questions in the Q&A or chat. So we will give it one more minute here, just so Tim can complete the typed answer. And just another reminder again, that if you do have any follow-up questions you would like to submit at any point in time, you can go ahead and contact New Zoning Bylaw, so newsnbl@cityofkingston.ca. Staff will be able to get back to you on that. Okay, everyone, that concludes today's online open house for the New Zoning Bylaw and Central Kingston Growth Strategy. On the screen, we do have a quick exit poll here. If you can go ahead and fill that out, that would be fantastic. It helps us tailor our future public engagement sessions. It is about the online platform and the facilitation, not the zoning bylaw specifically. So comments would be much appreciated there. Again, complete the evaluation. poll, if you would like, you can rewatch the session on the city's YouTube channel. That's the City of Kingston YouTube channel, not the council meetings, just to be clear. And you can also contact planning staff to sign up for project updates. Once again, I'd like to thank you for attending and have a great evening.